When the Trump for President campaign started, Rupert Murdoch, the owner-operator of Fox News, reacted like most people, thinking it was a bad joke and an embarrassment. His first tweet about it was after the Trump announcement speech. Rupert Murdoch defended Mexican immigrants against Donald Trump's accusations about their criminal behavior and ended the tweet with the simple message, "Trump wrong." About a week later, when Donald Trump insulted John McCain for being a prisoner of war, saying, quote, "I like people who weren't captured," Rupert Murdoch tweeted, "When is Donald Trump going to stop embarrassing his friends, let alone the whole country?" We now know the answer to that question is never. And in the meantime, Rupert Murdoch has embarrassed himself and Fox News and the Wall Street Journal and the New York Post by reversing his personal position on candidate Trump and using every one of those media outlets he owns to support the Trump candidacy and now the Trump presidency, to the point that an editorial writer at Rupert Murdoch's Wall Street Journal was recently let go for being consistently anti-Trump, while, of course, being consistently conservative. Any thoughtful conservative has known from the start that it is impossible to be both conservative and pro-Trump. And that is why it has been impossible for shows like this to book intellectually honest and logical conservative supporters of Donald Trump. They don't exist. Pulitzer Prize-winning syndicated columnist George F. Will is the inheritor of William F. Buckley's position as America's leading conservative intellectual commentator and the most artful prose stylist among them. Throughout the Trump campaign, George Will became an increasingly lonely voice at Fox News by refusing to bend his conservative principles to find something positive to say about Donald Trump. George Will has been anti-Trump from the start being the 2012 campaign cycle, when Donald Trump threatened to run for president. That's when George Will called Trump a political sociopath. Here is some of what George Will had to say on Fox News.
Donald Trump doesn't do evidence. He says apoplexy is a substitute for arguments. He's a one-trick pony. He consists of saying, "I'm rich, everyone who disagrees with me is stupid, and all our problems are simple if you'll put me in charge." Donald Trump is a con artist and all the rest, a clown act.
The day after the Trump inauguration, Fox News confirmed that George Will's contract was not being renewed. Rupert Murdoch stopped tweeting about Donald Trump in the middle of the presidential campaign. He was last seen entering Trump Tower on January 15th, when he obtained an interview with Donald Trump for the Times of London, a Murdoch-owned newspaper. When Donald Trump is looking for a friendly question in his press conferences, he knows the safest place to look is wherever the Murdoch-owned press corps is sitting. The story of Rupert Murdoch's conversion to Trumpism is part of the story of conservative Republicans' conversion to Trumpism, Paul Ryan's conversion to Trumpism, Mitch McConnell's conversion to Trumpism. And to guide us through a discussion of how Republican conservatism converted to Trumpism, we are now joined by George F. Will, syndicated columnist, Pulitzer Prize winner, and former Republican. George, welcome to The Last Word. Very happy to have you here. Tell us about that middle of the summer moment where you broke with the Republican Party and publicly announced you were leaving the party. What got you to that point?
Well, actually, it was on the 2nd of June, I remember it well. Paul Ryan, for his own reasons and responding to his own pressures, and I'm not judging him about this, he endorsed Mr. Trump, and the next morning I went in and changed my registration, because if Paul Ryan, the very best of the Republican Party, was going to help normalize Donald Trump, then I felt the party was going somewhere I did not want to go.
How do you trace that conversion, that what happened to Paul Ryan, what happened to Rupert Murdoch, what happened to what you've seen happen to Mitch McConnell and so many others over the course of this year? That last year?
Well, I sympathize with the leaders of the Congressional Party. The Congressional Party has its own existence, its own corporate duties, and the presidency is not everything. You know, the presidency is not all of the federal government. The federal government isn't all of American governance, and American government isn't all of American life. So Mr. Trump is a small part of this, larger than perhaps we wish he were, but the modern presidency has become swollen beyond all the founders' recognitions. But that being so, Mr. McConnell and Mr. Ryan have their own duties and their own imperatives and their own people to lead. I am a free agent, however. I do not have to do that. I've spent 40 years at the project of that Bill Buckley really began in the mid-1950s, of making American conservatism intellectually coherent and politically palatable. That is incompatible with the Trump presidency.
As you look back on the history of the Republican Party and the conservative movement, do you see now any signs of the seeds being planted here or there for what eventually gave us Donald Trump as a Republican nominee and now a Republican president?
I really don't. I really think he's what the economists call an exogenous factor, something that swooped in from God knows where. Take, for example, Mr. Bannon. Mr. Bannon is a recognizable phenomenon. He's a continental European right-winger. Blood, soil, throne, altar, all the rest. There really is no American pedigree for that kind of thought. This is, I hate to use the word to a protectionist president, this is an import from Europe.
George, you suffered the Trump assaults on Twitter that were nonstop, including at a certain point him saying on Twitter, Fox News should fire George Will. Did you ever feel a pressure coming from Fox News about that issue?
None. No one at Fox ever tried to rein me in. There's an analog here. When I went to work in my first job in Washington journalism was as Washington editor of Bill Buckley's National Review. I began that in January 1973, just as the Watergate cover-up was about to unravel. And Bill Buckley was stuck with me. I very quickly decided that Richard Nixon was guilty and eventually the Watergate would be traced to the Oval Office. Bill Buckley never once tried to restrain me, although I was hurting him with some of the contributors who helped keep National Review afloat at that time. And with regard to Fox News, no one ever pressured me. Now, I was not invited to participate in the coverage of the Cleveland Republican Convention, but that's their decision. But no one ever spoke to me about that, and I have nothing but fond memories of working with Chris Wallace and James Rosen and all the rest.
But there were some really awkward friction points there. You had reviewed, for example, Bill O'Reilly's book, just simply the finest review I've read of an O'Reilly book, in what he considered to be the most vicious and unfair possible terms. And it's hard to imagine there not being some kind of tensions in the hallways about that.
Well, I'm sure that there are lots of tensions in the hallways at the News Corp in New York, I gather, but yeah, I think that there is a O'Reilly factor at Fox News, and I certainly got crosswise with them, but that's my job, is to do things like that. I mean, one of the projects of the American left has been to discredit Ronald Reagan. They got an enormous assist from Bill O'Reilly's perversely named book, Killing Reagan. I read it, which may be more than O'Reilly's done, I don't know, decided it was an outrage and acted accordingly.
What happens now to George Will conservatives, George Will Republicans and or former Republicans as you approach future ballots of people who are supporters of Donald Trump on the ballot as Republicans or a Donald Trump re-election campaign?
Well, Donald Trump has to perform now. The next thing he has to do is submit a budget. When the budget comes up calling for $1 trillion in infrastructure spending, a tax cut that will lose by a bipartisan assessment $5.8 trillion over a decade, plus an increased military spending, plus protectionism, which means government deciding what Americans can consume at what prices and in what quantities, what's called economic planning and crony capitalism and all the rest. When that budget comes up, people are either going to rediscover their conservative convictions, or there's going to be a banquet, a feast of people eating words they've spoken for 30 years. I'll tell you who to watch. Watch Congressman Meadows from North Carolina. He's the head of the Freedom Caucus. The Freedom Caucus represents, to paraphrase what Howard Dean said when he represented the Democratic wing of the Democratic Party, they represent the Republican wing of the Republican Party. These are the true blue conservatives, and I think you're going to find that at that point conservatism begins to rediscover itself. So
would it be the $9 trillion increase in the national debt that is right there in the budget documents that they've already filed? Is that the thing we're going to be hearing about the most?
Well, that'll get your attention, certainly.
Yeah.
But it is, again, I think when they realize all that you embrace when you embrace protectionism, enormous executive discretion, government planning, essentially, what we can consume and how the economy will work and who shall be winners and who shall be losers, when they realize the slippery slope they're on, away from bedrock conservative principles, I think the things will change by midsummer.
And someone might have to remind them that tariffs are, in fact, sales taxes on goods sold in the United States paid by the American taxpayer consumer. And I have a feeling that George Will columns might be reminding them of that.
Well, it'll be conservatives will have to decide whether they really want a new revenue stream to the federal government.
George F. Will, thank you very much for joining us. Really appreciate your first appearance here on the show.
Glad to be with you.